Test, test. Ah, there we go. Thank you. Good evening. How's everybody doing? Very good. We're happy that you have us here tonight. I think Nikolai said we've already done a presentation this morning, and we're happy to be over here. I wanted to come out and say howdy because we're from Texas, but you guys aren't that far away from Texas, so I didn't say howdy. But we're going to give you a story tonight. Going to run you through an 18, 19-year journey. Jennifer Schuett is an amazing woman. You're going to meet her in just a minute. This is her journey. Began when she was 8 years old as a child, and she was abducted through her bedroom window. We'll go into details here in just a minute. But you're going to see what an amazing person she is. Also, the other big important thing that I want you to take away from this is law enforcement getting involved, working with survivors and victims such as Jennifer and the different agencies involved, just to bring justice to someone like Jennifer and the things that they've gone through. I'm Detective Tim Cromie. I've been with the Dickinson Police Department now I'm going on my 15th year with Dickinson. I'm in my 29th year of law enforcement over in the state of Texas. I got into it many years ago, trying it out as one of those jobs. My father was a police officer for a period of time, and I heard stories about what he did, and I thought, I want to try that for a while. I'm stuck in it now. I can't do anything else. I'm too old, so I have to make the best of it. So we're going to start talking about Jennifer Schuett, and I told Nikolai I'm probably going to get down off of this stage real quick because I don't do well up on the stage. I do better walking around down here. So this is a case that started August 10th of 1990 in Dickinson, Texas. It ended up being a attempted capital murder case in the state of Texas. Attempted capital murder, a murder or an attempted murder homicide involving some other felony rises to the level of an attempted capital murder case. 18 years before our investigation, and I simply have that up there because that's before I became involved in our other, we refer to the three of us, there's a third wheel of our tricycle that isn't here tonight, Special Agent Richard Redinson with the FBI, who came on board when I got the case, and we worked the case together, and that'll be part of the discussion tonight. Talk a little bit about how this came about. Do you want to talk about the chronology?
I'll cover this part. Let me just start off by saying when the attack occurred in 1990, I was 8 years old. I had just finished my second grade year of elementary school and was going into my third grade year. I was raised by my mother. She was a single mom, and my father had been in and out of prison my entire life. He still is, and we don't have a relationship. So he wasn't around. My mom was raising me on her own, working 2 or 3 jobs at a time to support us. And my grandfather, her father, was very involved in the community of Dickinson and started to notice the crime rate was going up. So he built homes, and a foreclosed home had come up for sale nearby, right in between where we lived in our apartment complex and where my grandparents lived about a mile down the road. So he purchased that foreclosed home and fixed it up for my mother and I, and was wanting us to move into that home in just a couple of weeks, right before I would go into the third grade year of elementary school. So my mother and I, it had just been her and I my whole life. We had been living in this apartment complex for about 5 years, and we're getting ready to move into our home. And we had gone to the house to do some yard work. And in Texas in August, the weather is hot and muggy. There's a lot of mosquitoes. And this new home was surrounded by woods, and it was at the end of a cul-de-sac. And out doing the yard work, I, of course, got a lot of mosquito bites. That evening, we went back to our apartment to go to sleep, and I was itching my mosquito bites in my sleep. I had never slept in my own bed before. I had always been afraid of the dark, and I had my own room right next door to my mom's, but I just refused to sleep in there and wanted to be close with her. So we went back to the apartment, had our usual nighttime routine, went to bed with my mother. She woke me up about 2:30 a.m. and said I was kicking her in my sleep, itching those mosquito bites, and basically had to beg me to go into my own room that evening, or that morning. So I remember saying, just because I love you, Mom, I'm going to go sleep in my own room tonight. And so I went in my room. I had a big lamp shaped like a light bulb, and I turned that on so that my room would be bright. I got out my piggy bank and some books, and I fell asleep. Not long after, we don't know the exact time, but I was taken out of my window by a stranger, and he carried me down the sidewalk of the apartment complex and put me in his car and calmed me down by telling me he was an undercover police officer and told me everything would be okay. When he carried me out, he had taken me out through my bedroom window and had me laying across his arms, and I looked back and could see my mother's car parked in her parking spot at the apartment. So I already knew something was not right. I had also never been watched by anyone. My mom didn't have time to go out and party as a young mother. She just worked all the time. So I'd never been watched by anyone except for grandparents. And I just knew that something wasn't right here. He put me in the vehicle and drove down Dietz Road, which is one of the main thoroughfare roads in Dickinson. It goes from one side of town to the other. And we passed my grandparents' home. And I told him, I said, you can drop me off there because all of their vehicles were there. And he said, no, no one is home. And he continued on and went, pulled into the parking lot of my elementary school, Silvernagle Elementary. And there he said that my mom would soon come to pick me up. And he offered me candy, which we're taught in elementary school not to accept candy from strangers. And then soon after, he was telling me a lot of generalizations. Your dad loves you more than your mom. Your dad has a big gang together. Things about uncles, and just at 8 years old, you would believe that this person would know your family. And as much as I wanted to believe all of those things, I still kind of felt in my gut that something was very wrong here. We pulled out of the elementary school parking lot and went about a mile down the road to an overgrown field off of a short gravel road. That was also a cul-de-sac. And there he pulled into what we call in Texas is a bar ditch along the side of the road. And I was questioning him. I left out. I was a very curious 8-year-old. I always got in trouble for asking too many questions. But that actually came in handy during this situation because I was kind of interrogating him. I was wanting him to prove to me that he was a police officer, whether he was an undercover police officer or not. I wanted to know, where's your gun, where's your badge? And he told me once parked that his gun was in the back seat. So I stood on the front bucket seat of the vehicle to look into the back seat for this gun or badge, and he immediately ripped my panties off and laid me in the front seat of the vehicle and started to lick me all over my body. On the ride there from passing my grandparents' house to the school, I was so terrified and scared that I had urinated all over him, and that didn't faze him at all. He was just licking me all over, and at one point held a knife to my throat and asked if am I scaring you, little girl? Am I scaring you? And then apologized later on. And once at this field, he got me out of the vehicle and kind of played hide and seek, or it was like we were hiding from other people. He took his shirt off and had me hide, right there on the overgrown bush that was facing the road. And at one point, a car kind of slowed down, I'm guessing to write down the license plate number, and he just said that, they're just someone probably being nosy and we needed to hide from them kind of thing. And eventually, I was unconscious and remember waking up being dragged behind him by my ankles through this overgrown field. I could feel sticks puncturing me, thorns. I didn't know that he had slit my throat from ear to ear at this point. So he left me in a fire ant pile for dead, and I heard his car door slam, and he left, and never saw him again. I awoke, and it was light outside, and there was this little dog that kept coming up to me barking, and then would go home to his owner and then come back and bark, and trying to tell his owner that something was wrong, but the owner never came. He figured the dog was just barking at a rabbit or something in the field. Later on that day, about 6 o'clock in the evening, I was found by children playing tag in the field. Off of this short gravel road, there was a house off of a main road, California Street, and children lived there, and their back door basically opened up into this field, so they would go out and play, and they had forts and little trails that they had made in the field. So they were out there playing tag, and one of them tripped over my foot, and that's how I was found just in time. Life Flight came out and brought me by helicopter to UTMB in Galveston, and there I was treated for a lacerated throat and trachea.
I should mention that I did not work for the Dickinson Police Department in 1990. I worked for another law enforcement agency, so a lot of what I tell you at the beginning of our presentation is history from documentation and reports. Going back here, Jennifer's mother came into the room early in the morning, found Jennifer was missing. Very quickly, she started checking with neighbors. Jennifer's windows, the drapes were pulled open, and she did a quick check with neighbors and realized that nobody had seen Jennifer, the friends in the apartment complex. So Jennifer's mother, Jennifer had no history of running away, and obviously in law enforcement, that's one of the first things that's considered when there's a child who's missing. Is this a runaway case, or is this actually an abduction? There was a canvass of the apartment complex done very quickly by responding officers, checking door to door if anyone had seen Jennifer or friends that she was playing with. No one had had contact with Jennifer since the previous day. So it started to become evident very quickly to the officers that this was not just a runaway case or Jennifer was missing because she was out of her house and with somebody else. They quickly started to do some crime scene processing, minimal things, checking for fingerprints on the windows and things, and there were no fingerprints on the windows or the windowsills. We're talking about 1990, and some of the hurdles that they had that we have advantages over nowadays, there were no security cameras in apartment complexes back in those days. So that would be one of the first things we would use to our advantage nowadays, is to go and start pulling security footage from apartment complexes nearby, but they didn't have that luxury back then. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the police department realized by this time this is a missing child, and they started to check. Dickinson was a small community back then, about just under 10,000 population, a lot of vacant fields, a lot of overgrown areas. But being that Dickinson is halfway between Houston and Galveston, right along the coast in Texas, and being in the Houston-Galveston metroplex, we had one of the advantages of having major television stations that are affiliated with the major networks, and one of those stepped up, offered the use of their news helicopter to start searching the area in some of those overgrown and wooded fields. In the afternoon, the police department conducted a press conference to announce that we had a missing child and this was an abduction case, to get the information out there into the general public. Jennifer's grandfather at the time, I should tell you that the Dickinson Police Department was in its infancy, had only come to be in 1983. By 1990, had a small force, only had one detective that was assigned to investigate crimes, to collect evidence. So there wasn't a division of investigators for the Dickinson Police Department. And Jennifer's grandfather, who had been in the community for a long time, was concerned about the department's ability to investigate. And he contacted the FBI, who, for an initial point of the investigation on that day, they were involved to a small extent at that time. And like Jennifer said, about 6:30 in the evening, she was found across town in a field, and she was naked, and her throat had been cut from ear to ear. To give you a little bit of an idea of where we're talking about, this is down on the bottom left-hand corner. That's Jennifer's apartment complex, and this yellow line represents the route across town where Jennifer was driven by her abductor. And we only know that because Jennifer survived, and she's able to share that information with us. So that's why we know exactly how they went across town. Over in the very bottom corner over here, you can see a yellow line. That is Interstate I-45 that runs from Galveston up through Houston and on up to Dallas. It's a major highway, a major thoroughfare. You can see it's only a couple of blocks away from Jennifer's apartment. One of the theories that we had when we got involved was, why would somebody not take the easiest route out of town and drive? This is almost 3.5 miles into the other side of Dickinson with a child who's been abducted. Just one of the theories that we had, Agent Renison and I, when we got involved. These are some of the hospital photos that were taken of Jennifer's injuries when she was taken to the hospital. I had previously met Jennifer before I got involved with the case when she had been up at the police department. And going back to those photos, one of the first things I thought when I got the case assigned to me, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, was these are some of the most horrendous autopsy photos I have seen in my career. And about that amount of time it took for me to realize that these were not autopsy photos, because I had actually met Jennifer as an adult very briefly before the case was assigned to me. But that was my initial impression from all my years in law enforcement. So Jennifer was found about 6:30 in the evening, and the area where Jennifer was located was searched, and there was evidence collected at the scene. Because of the day of time, darkness fell fairly quickly at some point. The next day, the search was expanded in the area, and there was some clothing found not too far from where Jennifer was located. And that clothing included the clothing that Jennifer was wearing, which was girls' panties with blue roses, a pink pajama top, and there was also a pair of men's underwear and a t-shirt in the grassy area that were all together. And it was really very close, less than a quarter of a mile around the corner from where Jennifer was. This was taken from one of the reports, Officer Danny Salcedo, who was the officer that found the clothing, and he wrote in his report, the clothes appeared that the male's underwear had been torn off or cut off, and they were wrapped with the child's pink shirt. That's very important documentation to put evidence together so we could connect it later on to Jennifer's victimization in the crime. Eventually, these items were turned over to the Galveston County Sheriff's Department. One of the issues was where Jennifer was abducted from belonged to the Dickinson Police Department's jurisdiction for investigation because it was inside the city limits of Dickinson. Where she was found was actually outside the incorporated city limits of Dickinson, and that responsibility fell to the Galveston County Sheriff's Department. So we initially had two agencies automatically that were involved in this investigation. The Sheriff's Department had been around for quite some time, and they had an excellent criminal investigations division and an ID unit to collect evidence. So they were actually called in not only because they had jurisdiction, but because they had experience. And a lot of the evidence that was collected was turned over to the Galveston County Sheriff's Department for preservation and testing and processing and those things. This is where Jennifer was located, up on 22nd Street, just off of California. And right around the corner, that's where the clothing was found. You can see that's very close to where Jennifer was located. These are actual pictures of the clothing, evidence photos, and you can see here, this is Jennifer's pajama top and the men's underwear, and you can see off to the side, that's where it was cut or torn off. That's just another close-up of the evidence photo. So that gives us a good reason to put the men's underwear with Jennifer's clothing, that it wasn't just they were found in the vicinity of each other. They were actually found together. So the initial investigation, while Jennifer was in the hospital, she was viewed by investigators, but she was unable to speak.
Once I arrived at the hospital and the doctors were able to see the extensive damage done to my neck, they said that I would never be able to speak again. There was no movement or anything else that could be done to repair my vocal cords, and my voice box had also been cut, so they informed my family that I wouldn't be able to speak. And I was in the PICU for about a week, and then eventually moved to my own room a week later. And after 2 weeks in the hospital, I was actually released to go home, which was pretty incredible for the amount of damage done to my neck. While in the hospital, I can say that I was afraid of all males and male doctors, male family members, and I became very frustrated because I had what I thought was a normal childhood up until that point, even with my dad not being in my life and my mom working a lot. I had what I thought to be a normal childhood. I loved to sing and swim and be very active, so it was really hard for me to have to be in the hospital for that 2-week period. And I also, even though I was traumatized, I really wanted this person to be caught. So my nurse and I in the PICU bonded almost immediately, and she told me that she had a daughter my same age, 8 years old, whose name was Jessica. The nurse's name is Sharon McBride, and I still keep in touch with her to this day. And at that point, I just thought, what if he, goes after Jessica and does this to her. I don't want her to have to go through what I just did. So I asked for pen and paper, and I was heavily medicated, traumatized, but I wanted to help in him being captured. I knew from early on that if you did something bad, there needed to be a consequence. And so I started to write notes in the hospital of all of the events that had taken place previously on the night of the attack. And just kept writing, and I would give the notes to my mom. And back then in 1990, being such a small community, everyone was on guard. And I mean, I still hear people's stories. Old classmates still tell me they slept in their hallway by their parents' bedroom. I mean, everybody was just really terrified and didn't know who would do such a thing in our small town community. So I had police officers guarding the door outside of the PICU, and then when I was moved, I had police officers there. And even into my 3rd grade year of elementary school, there was a police officer that would sit outside of my classroom. While in the hospital, I also worked with Lois Gibson, who is very well known in Houston. She's a forensic sketch artist. In 1990, she had just started out, and being a younger female, they asked her to come to my bedside in the PICU and work with me to come up with a composite sketch of the suspect. She did, and they only gave her an hour to work with me since I was so medicated and aggravated with all of the tubes in my neck and not being able to speak. It was very frustrating. So just by me writing notes, we came up with a composite sketch, and then I asked her to do a drawing of his car as well. These are some of the notes that I wrote in the hospital. He said his name was Dennis. I was talking about my attacker. The man told me, "Take your clothes off." I said no. He took them off. The man undressed me and licked my tutu, and then he drank beer right before that. The man dragged me to a big field. I'm in pain. He drove to woods and got out. I did too. Undressed me and licked me all over. I said, "Can I put my clothes on?" He said, "I don't want you to." Pocket knife. He dragged me to a field. And then this is the sketch that we came up with. This was 4 days after the attack.
I'll tell you that the notes that Jennifer wrote to her mother, which were eventually turned over to the officer that was guarding her at the hospital, is, as far as law enforcement is concerned, that's a big piece of evidence, because we have, in Jennifer's own handwriting, very shortly after the attack, we have her account of what occurred. And like I said, for law enforcement, that's a strong piece of evidence because we have it in her word. I can tell you, when we got involved and I started going through some of the case files and reading those notes and get to the one that you have an 8-year-old child who's writing a note saying, "I'm in pain." I don't care how long you've worked in law enforcement. Like I said, at that time, I'd been in law enforcement about 24 years. It still gets you right here. But this is the composite sketch that they worked on, and the car sketch that she and Lois Gibson put together. So the evidence that we had at that, or they had at that time in 1990, was tested for serology. There was no DNA test completed because at that time DNA was in its infancy, and if you didn't get satisfactory serology tests, you didn't send it on to DNA. That was just the standard for the time. Jennifer's pajama top was not tested at all. The men's underwear was also tested, but only for serology, once again, not for DNA. This was pretty much the standard back in 1990. There were some fingernail scrapings taken from Jennifer at the hospital. Those quantities, the samples were limited in amount for conclusive testing purposes. Back in 1991, there were also some other swabs completed as part of the medical exam. And they were tested, but they did not show any blood or semen at the time. In the medical report, and I can tell you when we got involved, the medical report is probably about just unbelievable, the medical report. She was in ICU in the hospital for over 2 weeks. But she was released about 2 weeks later. Some of the things that were important was one of the doctors had noted his impressions were sexual assault, blunt anal trauma being an unknown object, and one of the other doctors had noted that, in my professional opinion, this child is a victim of physical and sexual abuse. And why is that important? Because in the state of Texas, like I said, for a attempted capital murder case or a capital murder case, you have to have a homicide or an attempted homicide in connection with another felony event. And although we had the kidnapping that Jennifer was, we now have a third party who is not related to law enforcement that has documented that there is another felony crime that has been committed, the sexual assault, and that's a medical profession. And so later on down the road, that was big evidence for us again in law enforcement. So we're going to move up to 2008, and we're kind of giving you the condensed version tonight. But in 2008, I was handed the case from a previous investigator who had the case for quite some time and said, Detective Cromie is actually my boss. He called me in the office and said, I'm handing you the case. He was moving to a different division. And my assignment with the Dickinson Police Department is child crimes, sexual assaults, missing persons. So he said, I'm handing you this case. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. But I was a little excited because it was a cold case. And in law enforcement, that's what we do. We seek out justice. We try to find the answers. It's a job for us, but it's also a passion. You try to put the pieces of the puzzle together. On February 18th of 2008, I had a meeting with Jennifer, wanted to introduce myself, let her know about I was going to be working on her case. I was excited to meet with her. She was a live victim, survivor of the crime. She could give me personal information. And this was a challenge for any law enforcement officer to have an 18-year-old cold case. So I was excited about meeting with her. I can tell you that meeting didn't go quite the way I thought it was going to go when I first met with her.
After 18 years of this being a cold case, there had never been any solid leads or suspects. So you can imagine the frustration that I dealt with over a period of 18 years of my case being handed off from investigator to investigator. And each time that happens, it's like you've already built this bond with this investigator, and you have all your faith in that investigator that they're going to solve your case, and then they get moved to a different department, or they get moved somewhere else in the station to patrol or whatever, and they can't work on your case any longer. So then it's, here's so-and-so, and now he's going to solve your case, or she's going to solve your case, and they make you promises, and it's just a big mess over an 18-year period. So I went into this meeting feeling very angry. This investigator that had my case before him had had it the longest period of time. He had had it over a period of 10 years. And I became very frustrated, especially with him, because I had graduated high school. I had moved out of state, moved back, and came back wanting to know, what are you doing with my case? I don't want it to just be sitting there. I'd always been very vocal since a child with wanting there to be justice, and not just for myself, but for others. I was very concerned about this person being in our community or any other community, and didn't want any other child to have to go through what I had, like I told you earlier. So I really wanted justice and wanted to see this person in jail. And I think over time, even those in law enforcement became started to lose faith, I should say, that they could even do anything. But there were advances in DNA, and things had changed, but it was just about finding the person that wanted to do the footwork and working together and feeling as though I was a part of a team. Because me being the only witness and being a survivor of this, that investigator would need me as much as I would need him to make this happen. And I just didn't find a match with any of the previous investigators who were working on my case. No one was hearing me and the things that I wanted to say or the suggestions that I would make. At the end of the meeting, though, I left feeling really good about it, because through me crying those angry tears, Detective Cromie gave me tissues and was trying to calm me down, and he said that he would do whatever he had to, no matter how long it took, until it was him retiring or after, to get me the answers that I deserved. So for the first time in 18 years, I felt as though I was finally being heard. And I forgot to mention to you all that while in the hospital, I got mad at my mom because she wouldn't get me a chocolate bar from the gift shop, and I tried to yell my uncle's name to see if he would get me the chocolate bar, and a sound came out. And the doctors came in and put tubes down my nose to look into my throat, and they said there was no movement. They had me doing animal sounds, and there was no movement. But the next morning, I woke up and could talk. So there's still no medical explanation. So I always like to tell the audience that this is what I feel is my purpose in life, is to use my voice in sharing my story and hopefully making a difference. so that other survivors or those that are no longer with us, their families have the hope to get justice that they deserve. So anyway, I left that meeting feeling as though I was a part of a team and feeling empowered. And from then on, everything just kind of fell into place, and Detective Cromie brought Special Agent Richard Renison on board, and they just started to kind of get the ball rolling on my case and put all the puzzle pieces together.
It's amazing what happens when a woman gets her chocolate, isn't it? So I left that meeting, and I did. I told Jennifer I'll get you the answers. And as law enforcement, as detectives, that's one of the things. You don't give people promises that you don't know what the end result are going to be. So I kind of stepped in it really big. And I went back and sat at my cubicle because I don't want anybody to have an idea that I actually have an office. And I sat at my cubicle, and I thought, my gosh, what did I just do? But we started looking into the case, and Richard Renison was a good friend of mine. He had been working at one of the neighboring police departments before he went off to the FBI. So Richard and I, he worked child crimes for that law enforcement agency, League City Police Department, before he went off, and he worked child crimes with us. So we knew each other. We had worked on the same team in Galveston County on child abuse cases. And during talking together one day, it was just came out that I had this case, and he said, well, tell me about it. And one thing led to another. And you want to work it with me, FBI? And my theory was not that, Detective Cromie with the police department, Dickinson Police Department, is going to solve this crime. By no means did I think I was better than anybody else. But I felt like I could facilitate and bring in other agencies or other detectives, other resources, and pool everything together and work together to get answers for this young lady here, for the survivor. So Richard and I worked together, like I said. The first thing we did, we looked through a case file, and it was just a box of massive mixes of stuff. And there were VHS tapes, remember those things? Cassette tapes, yeah, some of those things. 35 millimeter film that, negatives, remember those things? A lot of stuff like that, had to go through all that. I told you earlier, Richard and I both had an inclination that this person was familiar with the area just because of the way they left the apartment complex. We learned that all the evidence, or most of the evidence, was going to be with the Galveston County Sheriff's Department, if they still had it, because their office was on Galveston Island, and they had moved from one building to another. And the island had already been through 2 major hurricanes since the time Jennifer's case started. We started to make a list of possible suspects and other things to do, and people to talk to, several meetings that we had with FBI and other detectives and things like that. And we felt our first priority was the evidence. So we went and met with Lieutenant Pruitt, actually Captain Pruitt, who's now retired with the Galveston County Sheriff's Department. Coincidentally, back in 1990, he was just a deputy working for the Sheriff's Department, and he was the deputy assigned to come out and collect the evidence at the scene. So he had a little bit of stake in this case already before Richard and I ever did. He was on the scene, collected all that evidence, and it was stored immaculately the way it should have been. We took 4 of 65 pieces of item that they had at the Sheriff's Department, the clothing that had been found, and we decided to send that off for DNA comparison at the lab up in Quantico with the FBI. One of the neat things about it was Ralph Garcia was the detective who had the case in 1990. He was now currently a chief of police at a neighboring police department. And one of the things that we found by going to the media and looking at their raw footage of things, when the clothing was found, one of the media outlets was there, and they actually had footage of him picking it up and putting it into paper bags, not wearing any gloves. Nothing against that. That's what happened in 1990. We weren't used to cross-contamination DNA. So it was pretty cool that we got to go over to Ralph and say, Chief, we need your DNA on a homicide case that we're working. Ralph, we all knew Ralph, and he was more than happy to do that and work with us. So the new investigation moves into 2009. This case was chosen by the FBI's CAR team, their Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, as a special to help out with some of the cases across the country. It was featured on numerous local media stations, also America's Most Wanted, and it gained a lot of new public interest and generated a lot of new public interest. Like I said, we looked at raw footage. So we were starting to move along, and we were getting different things, and all of a sudden, September 22nd comes along, 2009. I get a call from Richard Renison in the middle of the night, about 3:30, and he says, we have a DNA hit. Now, there was another suspect that we were looking at very heavily, in fact, to the point that Richard and I were making plans to go to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice prison system and interview this other suspect. So when Richard calls me, I'm like, well, it's not looking good for this guy. And he gives me the name of Dennis Earl Bradford. And I think my response to him on the phone was, who is Dennis Earl Bradford? He said, well, that was my response. Some of the things that we learned about Dennis Earl Bradford, remember Jennifer wrote his name was Dennis? Aha, in her own handwriting. He had been convicted in 1997 for a 96 sexual assault and kidnapping in Hot Springs, Arkansas. He received a 12-year sentence, did 4 years, and then released on parole. He was also arrested in March of 1991 for an assault on a female in a post office up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, which is roughly about a half a year after Jennifer's attack. We don't know the disposition on that case. He was interrupted in the middle of that attack by employees who were in the back of the post office. We now had to establish a link between Dennis Earl Bradford and Dickinson. He's from Arkansas. How do we put him in Dickinson some 19 years ago now? Well, I went back to the police department. Of course, I didn't go back to sleep that morning, even though it was 3:30. I went to work early, and I started looking through card catalogs that we had, the old index cards. Well, we still had some of those, all our stuff. And I started to find information about Dennis Earl Bradford. He was actually arrested in Dickinson in 1987. Had some addresses in there, and we were finding other addresses as we started to dig into Dennis Earl Bradford. This is all in a span of about 2 weeks, and you can imagine that the investigation ramped up extremely quick right now. And we're finding all these addresses and stuff. This is Jennifer's apartment right here, and that's the apartment complex. This is Dennis Earl Bradford's apartment complex in 1987 when he was arrested. That's the entire complex right there, very close to each other. This is the route that Jennifer said that he drove her. And the 3520 Ohio address that you saw earlier, that's the residence where he lived, which is just over a quarter of a mile off of that route. So it was that somebody was very familiar and very comfortable with the area. We got the Texas Department of Public Safety to pull some driver's license records from back in 1990. It took a little while because they had to go through the microfilm, remember that stuff? The images weren't, but available quite so quickly. This is the drawing or the sketch that Jennifer did with Lois Gibson. And I don't know, we thought it looked similar to his driver's license photo back in the day, but I'll let you guys decide. Yeah, one of the detectives, when I got the email from Richard and DPS and we were looking at this, one of the other detectives in our office said, this guy's day's getting worse by the minute and he doesn't even know it yet. So real quickly, we found that he had been released from prison in 2001. Shortly before we got this DNA hit, he actually was arrested in North Little Rock for solicitation of a prostitute back in August of 2009. We found out some other things about him living with his ex-wife. He had 2 children in Hot Springs. He was currently living in North Little Rock, Arkansas with his wife and some 3 stepsons. He worked as a welder. So we're making plans. We get a warrant for his arrest. We coordinate with the Arkansas authorities, and Richard and I come up here to meet with them and get him arrested, and we're going to sit down and talk to him. And there's an importance. We want a confession for a number of different reasons. We didn't want to tell him we had DNA. That's too easy. We wanted to hear it in his own words. Didn't want a defense attorney to say, well, you know, you told him you had DNA, so what was he going to do? He had to confess. We never once told him that we had DNA. And we had no DNA on Jennifer's clothing. Even after it went in 2008 and 2009, her DNA did not show up on her clothing. We also didn't want to say, a defense attorney to come along and say, well, you know, yeah, Jennifer's clothing was there. Yeah, my guy's a little weird. He likes to rip his clothes off as he's driving down the street and just throw it out the window. Because defense attorneys do things like that. So we wanted to find out some more details about the offense and things that had happened. Most importantly, we wanted a 0 chance of losing this case if it ever went to trial. And we did get a confession from Dennis Earl Bradford at the North Little Rock Police Department. We interviewed him for about 4 hours. He told us that the car belonged to his mother. And I apologize for this. It was his words. He said that Jennifer was so scared he shit in the front seat of her car. He talked about first having to try to break her neck, but he couldn't do that, so he ended up cutting her neck. And in her own words, she had written down that he choked her 4 times as hard as he could. He also admits to using the knife to cut her, and he said, I wanted her dead so I could have my way with her. Okay, that was in his own words. He says he leaves and he washes up the car at a nearby car wash. when the sketch is released to the media, he shaves off his mustache, never grows it back. And it was truly random. He had no connection to the family. No, it was just one of those things. He decided to do this that night. He told us that he had a propensity to drive around and flash women when he would see them from his car. But he had no connection, didn't know Jennifer. Her family just saw lights on in her room that night and decided to go and abduct her from out of there. He also, shortly after her attack in 1990, he attempted suicide, tried to shoot himself, but he chickened out, actually shot a hole in the roof of the trailer that the family was living in. He went to the UTMB hospital in Galveston, the John Seeley Hospital, which was the same hospital that Jennifer was being treated at the time for his suicide attempt and treatment there. After being released from the hospital, he left Texas and came to Arkansas. Never returned to Texas willingly. He did eventually return to Texas. This is Dennis Earl Bradford's photo in 1990, and this was when he was arrested in 2009, October 13th of 2009. The very next day after we had him arrested and got a confession, there was an extradition hearing in the Pulaski County courts up here. And that's extradition hearing is not a hearing of guilt or innocence or probable cause. It's just to determine that the person named in the warrant is the same person that is standing before the court, to bring them back to whatever jurisdiction has the case. Agent Renison and I sat down and talked to Dennis Earl Bradford and explained to him, you can fight the extradition, but you're going to end up in Texas sooner or later. You can come back on a plane with us, or you can sit here and wait till there's a governor's warrant, and you can ride back on a van. He decided he would come back with us. He waived extradition. And this is myself and Agent Renison over there escorting Dennis Earl Bradford into the Dickinson Police Department. We brought him back to Dickinson Police Department so that Jennifer would have the opportunity to see him. She didn't get to see him face to face, but she looked at him through some one-way mirrors that we had in one of the rooms that we placed him in, strictly for the fact that she could take a look at him and see him some years later. This was the night we got back. That's Richard Renison and myself and Jennifer and her boyfriend. We all went out to dinner after we got back the evening with Dennis Earl Bradford. His girlfriend called us after we got back and said, hey, I have some pictures. I dated him about that time in 89 and 90. Are you interested in the pictures? Anybody want to guess what my answer was? Yes. This is a picture of Dennis Earl Bradford and the girlfriend. Obviously, we've blurred out her face. He still has his mustache at the time, and those are the three photos that we could put together, or the three pictures of Dennis Earl Bradford at about that time, from 1990, 1989. This is the picture, the sketch of the car, and she also had a picture of Dennis with his mother's car, and that's the picture. So Jennifer did a pretty good job. I mean, she described the car facing the wrong direction, but other than that, we gave her a lot of credit. May 10th of 2010, I get a call in the middle of the night while waiting trial in the Galveston County Jail. Dennis Earl Bradford hung himself. And I called Richard when I got the call in the middle of the night, and we need to talk to Jennifer. We need to let her know. Richard was very gracious. He said, well, it's your case. I'll let you call her. Thank you very much. It was not a good call.
From the time that the attack had occurred, I kind of made it my own mission to remember all of the details of the attack. I really wanted to follow this through to the end and come full circle with it. So I made it a point to not let my mind naturally block things out, as many children experience when they go through traumatic things such as this. I also didn't want for it to be put into my mind things happened because someone told me they happened. So I really, really made it a point to remember all of the details of the attack as much as possible. I always wanted to have the same story because I had faith that one day we would go to court, and I wanted to be able to face this person and tell my story. So when the arrest occurred, I was just elated. I mean, they had my case for 18 months, and I had waited almost 20 years. And in an 18-month time period from us working together and them hearing my suggestions and allowing me to be a part of the solving of my own case, it got solved. So when he committed suicide, he'd only been in jail for 7 months, and it was our understanding that he was on suicide watch. And he was for 6 months. But a doctor made the decision to take him off of suicide watch, and that was the first thing I said to them when I got the call that he was arrested was, don't let him kill himself, because I really want to go to court. And so when he got to Galveston County, he was on suicide watch for 6 months. A doctor made the decision to take him off. And so that last month, he had access to everything, and previously had access to nothing, no clothes and a padded cell. So he had an opportunity, and he took it. He used his bed sheet and hung himself from a metal box hanging from the ceiling. And that wasn't the first suicide that had happened. This is a newly renovated jail that we have in Galveston County, and I believe it was the third suicide in like 6 months. So he made the decision to kill himself, and that was something that was really hard for me to deal with. The community, of course, people that hadn't been through this long journey for justice as I had, were of course excited that it was going to save them tax dollars. Police officers thought that he had gotten what he deserved, but for me, the survivor of the crime, that wasn't the ending that I wanted at that moment. I could have cared less what he did with himself afterward, after trial, but I felt as though just in a moment's time, he ripped everything away from me. On the 20-year anniversary of the attack, which is when the court date was supposed to, we were looking for that court date to happen, for trial to happen around the 20th anniversary of the attack in August of 2010. I instead got to drive to his grave site in Texas, and there I sat on his grave and read my victim impact statement. So I did finally get to talk to him per se, but it just isn't in the manner that I would have liked it to be.
Dennis Earl Bradford had some writings in his jail cell when he passed away, and share some of those with you very quickly. And I promise you, the spelling and the grammar in here is verbatim from his writings. I write a little bit better than this. But he talked about the day he was arrested, he knew he was going to take his own life. He didn't know how or when. How long was it going to take? Geez, I've been watching me like a hawk. Well, that's what they do in jails. Anyhow, and he talks about they finally gave him the opportunity, and they gave him the rope, and he took it. God made me. God made a mistake, a freak. I tried to hide that fact, and now I'm tired of hiding. I'm dreadfully sorry what I did to little Jennifer. This is the first time he's ever used her name. He always referred to her as that little girl, the baby. If someone had done this to Jessica, which was his daughter, the things that he would do. He just wanted to kill the monster inside of him. When we sat down and talked to him for the interview, he talked about the monster inside of him quite a bit. No medication on the planet can fix evil. Kind of think that ought to be on a bumper sticker myself. In a letter to his mom and dad talking about his mind, it said, "It's real scary in there and very dark. I fantasize about doing horrible, dreadful things. I try not to think that way, but I can't keep from it. Try to understand this. I am sane enough to be scared of myself, and I am insane enough to love the way I think." I can tell you that's a scary statement right there from anybody. What worked well for us? Great working relationship between Richard and I and the other agencies involved. We had evidence that was preserved for the most part. The advances in DNA and technology over the years and being able to use that to our advantage some 18, 19 years later. And having a live victim to work with, being able to sit down and talk with Jennifer as a survivor and get the story firsthand and not having to just read it from reports was just tremendous to both Richard and I to fill in any gaps that may have been there. Some of the things that didn't work well was Jennifer obviously had some previous interactions with investigators she was not happy with. There was no inventory of those boxes of stuff that I talked about at our police department, so going through a lot of that stuff took a lot of time and effort. It wasn't cataloged properly. And we did end up finding out later on that there were some missing items, and so thank goodness we didn't have those issues, and we didn't have to go to trial with those issues. I think one of the best things that came out, there was a huge press conference the day that we arrested Dennis Earl Bradford here in Arkansas, but back in Dickinson, Texas, there was a national media press conference, and Jennifer spoke, and I think my feeling is one of the best things that came out of that was a quote by her: "I am not a victim, but instead a victorious." Jennifer talked about there's been another chapter, and she's moved on, and this is Jennifer and her fiance, and that's little Jenna. So.
As a result of the rape in 1990, I found out when I was about 25 years old that as a result of the rape, I wouldn't be able to have children unless I had a lot of surgery and eventually would do in vitro. So a local doctor in Houston heard my story, and he said he wanted to make things right, and so he donated all of his services to us, and we went through the whole in vitro process and ended up with 8 embryos, and we've used 4 so far. We've done 2 rounds of in vitro, and I gave birth to my little girl in November 1st of 2012. So I always like to share that with you guys as a happy ending. I feel like she is my justice. So that's what I'm doing now is we do travel as much as possible. And I apologize, we kind of had to rush through this. We had a time crunch. We do usually do about a 3-hour presentation and had to cut it down for about an hour for you guys. But I apologize for that. We will take any questions. We are basically open book, so if you guys have any questions, we're more than happy to answer anything. If you want more details on a certain subject, we'll certainly let you know.
Sarah.
Did he get an Act 3 or a mental evaluation? And if so, what did it reveal? I mean, it sounds like from his writings that he was disturbed.
He was the doctors and psychologists that work with at the jail did obviously they talked with him and did some evaluations. There was nothing extensive because the trial process he had already been afforded an attorney. He was simply being evaluated for his own mental stability and placement in the county jail. There was no evaluation as far as connected to Jennifer's crime or anything because nothing had gone to court yet. There hadn't been any court orders for mental evaluation or anything like that. So no, there was no evaluation regarding any previous acts or related to Jennifer's crime. It was just strictly his mental capabilities and for placement in the county jail.
Although the FBI's behavioral analysis unit, they really did want to get their hands on him to analyze him because of the statements that he had made. They knew that they were working with someone that was really scary.
And the FBI's behavioral analysis unit worked with us prior to our interrogation or our interview with him. So they were heavily involved after we found out who he was preparing for the interview. And so.
Johnny. Bob, right in front of you. Yep.
I have a question for both of y'all. Detective, did anybody bring up the term intrusive thoughts since he mentioned a monster? And I guess the question I have for you is, I'd read about you going back to the field afterward, and I was wondering, what manner of treatment or something allowed you to where you were able to feel comfortable to be able to do that?
I always, since I was a child, I'd always, especially with my case being handed off over and over again, I would always go back to the field just because, and to also make sure it was mowed because it was so overgrown that no one could have seen me from the roadside. Had the children not found me, who knows how long I would have been in there. So they do, even to this day, they keep the lawn mowed down, and it looks almost exactly the same as it did back then, except for more trailer homes, and they keep it mowed. But I never, to be honest, therapy didn't work for me, counseling. My therapy has been talking about it as openly as I have my whole life, and just knowing that I'm helping others by sharing my story. So that's just what I've done, and I've always been just so open about it and like to talk about it and just know that I'm making a difference.
And to the question that you posed to me, the intrusive thoughts, there wasn't a whole lot done with the analysis of the interview or anything during that time because, like I said, the interview was kept not secretive, but it was not made public because for the court process and judicial reasons until after he committed the suicide. I know that the behavioral analysis unit up at the FBI has used that for training and interpretation, and they've used it, but there hasn't been any official report, and really because after the fact that he committed suicide, agencies aren't going to put a lot of emphasis in spending the money for something that's not going to trial anymore. But I know the behavioral analysis unit, I have not seen any of their reports because they use it for training for the FBI, but I know they're using that particular interview for training.
So you had a question over there?
Well, this is a very compelling story, but what is the message that you would like us to take away from this?
Really, we travel a lot and present the case study at a lot of law enforcement conferences or conferences for victims, or really any profession that works with survivors of crime or those that have unfortunately been victims of crime and their families. And what our message kind of is to really break down the barriers in working together. For us, for him, it wasn't about him being this hero cop of a small town that's going to solve this big cold case. It was about getting me answers that I deserved, and him keeping the promise to me. So in him making that promise, he knew that he likely needed to use all of his resources. And me being a living victim and him having other resources with other agencies, such as the FBI, he went ahead and kind of opened the door to use those other resources. So really, I would just encourage any of your professions in working with any kind of survivor or victim of violent crime to encourage them to use their voice and letting them know it's okay to talk about it and be open about it and to seek justice.
And I think on my aspect, taking away from this is that I learned early on in my career in law enforcement, a senior officer told me one time, the biggest problem with law enforcement and police work is we have to choose from the human race. We make mistakes. We're not perfect. And there are things, but for the general public to not give up on law enforcement. And when you have people like Jennifer who didn't have such great interactions with law enforcement in the beginning and through the process, but she continued to work with law enforcement and communicate with them about the case. And there is hope, even though this case was 18 years old when I got involved. There is hope. There's never going to be, there should not be an answer of this is the end. If a case isn't solved, sometimes you may have to, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and sometimes you have to bring it to somebody else's attention and see. And sometimes we in law enforcement have to step up and we have to man up and have to look at it with different eyes. Somebody else has to come in who's not involved and look at things anew. So.
Anyone else?
Last one in the back. Sorry. It's coming.
You talked about being unconscious. Was that from having your throat slit, or did he hit you on the head, or drug you? Or?
No, he choked me. Like I wrote in that note, he choked me as hard as he could 4 times. He was trying to strangle me to death, and he also said in the confession that he tried to break my neck after that, and he, for some reason, wasn't strong enough or capable of breaking my neck. So then he, went to slitting my throat. And yes, that was, I was basically bleeding to death for 12 to 14 hours, but because of him putting me in the fire ant pile, the fire ants actually worked to clot the blood in my neck. So they ended up, as horrible as they are, and I still to this day, I have a lot of freckles, so you can't see, but I have white scars, and I'm very pale too, so that helps, but I have white scars, dots, all over my body of fire ant scars, and it's been 24 years now. So they worked to clot the blood in my neck. The rain that day, the kids weren't allowed to play outside that day because it was raining. And so the rain had stopped that evening, and that's why they were allowed to go outside, and that's when I was found. But the rain that day helped in keeping my wound moist. So all of those little miracles ended up really helping in my survival for the length of period that I was left there bleeding to death. So. Does anybody else have any questions or comments or anything at all? No? Okay.
We want to thank you for having us
thank
here.
you so much.
And while this is a kind of a tragic story, we hope you go away with a little bit different outlook of survivors and law enforcement working together. We want to thank Nikolai in the Clinton School for bringing us up here to talk to you. We enjoy sharing Jennifer's story of survival. It's truly miraculous, and she's just an amazing woman. Every time I get to speak and share a stage with her, I take it as an opportunity and one of the blessings of my job and having this case land in my lap that I get to be with somebody like that has the power and the determination that she does. She's just truly an amazing person.
Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you.